Hello, I'm Russell Lowe, and it really is a pleasure to speak to you on the subject of why Paragon CRT. I've been working with Paragon CRT for over 10 years now, and it is really the most exciting and the best thing I do in my clinical practice. It has changed optometry for me, and it has just been a wonderful journey. So hopefully I can share some of that with you as we go through a few slides at this stage. So speaking of slides, this is the first of a 4-part webinar series sponsored by Paragon Vision Sciences, and as you can see here, coming up in July we have a follow-up presentation that I'll be delivering on myopia control in CRT, and that is really a very big deal and something I can't wait to get into and tell you a little bit about. A little later on in the year, Angela will be discussing how to integrate CRT into the practice. And then in December, Ken Kopp, who is a technical director at Paragon Vision Sciences, will be walking you through the slightly more complex aspects of fitting and prescribing the dual axis lens. So right now we're at the beginning and we're looking at some real basic information on why should we really be thinking about putting Paragon CRT, building it into our practices. The agenda that I'm going to go through with you will discuss exactly that, aspects of why it is important, I think, to look at a CRT product in the practice. Then we'll get specifically into some key aspects of fitting. And then finally, I'm going to tease out what I consider to be 3 or 4 really essential key steps for managing the aftercare process. So along the way, we'll have these here and there little icons up in the top right of the screen, which will just designate slides that I think are of a particular value and importance. So let's start at the beginning. And why Paragon CRT? Well, really, I think the first and foremost, and perhaps for me the most important, is the idea of just improving the general level of refractive care that you're providing to your patients in the practice. It's another modality, it's another way of enabling myopic patients in particular to see clearly. And boy, do these patients love to see without the aid of glasses or daytime contact lenses. If you haven't worked in this field, the joy of uncorrected visual acuity at a clear level is just a beauty to behold. So that's a very encouraging part of the process. But I should also mention that you know, when you get involved with Paragon CRT, it's going to bring a new profit line into the practice, and for us this has been very, very significant. It's something like over 15% of our gross, and the thing about this area is that it remains pretty independent of the ups and downs of the economics of the day. So when the whole of all of your competitors, all of your colleagues are sort of struggling to get patients in through the door, you'll find that your Paragon CRT patients will be coming back for their regular aftercares, and business will be proceeding along as usual. So with these two things added to the practice, it tends to lead to enormous practitioner satisfaction, and you'll forgive me for putting up this iconic album cover of the Rolling Stones. As an old Rolling Stones fan from way back, I thought I'd slip this into the talk. And it really helps me to say that really it's not just the practitioner, it's the whole practice, the whole team will benefit from the increase in satisfaction, seeing these happy patients in the practice. Now, stepping away from the practice and looking at the rest of the world, you may or may not be familiar with this poster that was published recently by the Centre for Contact Lens Research at the School of Optometry and Vision Science in Waterloo. And the point of this slide is to say really that We have a lot more myopia on the planet over the last 10 to 20 years, and it's not just an issue in East Asia and Far East Asia. In fact, it's a global issue, as we've probably heard, and countries like Canada and the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe have all shown incredible increases in myopia in a very short time, such that there's something clearly going on other than just the influence of genetics alone. You might notice that Australia doesn't seem to feature on this particular chart, but we're well aware that Australia and New Zealand and our neighbouring countries have all equally shown some incredible increases in myopia. Some countries have myopia now a prevalence in excess of 90%. So it really is a big problem, a World Health Organization recognized issue. And of course, it's not just the myopia alone, but it's the risk of serious ocular health problems that come along with these enlarged eyeballs. So when we have an increase in the size of the eyeball, we have an increase in the risk of a number of serious eye health issues over a patient's lifetime, and one of the most common causes for blindness in the world are these issues related to myopia. So if we can reduce the amount of myopia, we'll be doing our patients a great service. Now, in terms of reducing the amount of myopia, or myopia control as it's often referred to, there are a number of strategies that are well known. There are spectacle-based strategies, including bifocals and multifocals, that do seem to be effective at a certain level, and aberration control lenses. More common amongst the optical devices are contact lens-based technologies, which have the important advantage of remaining well-centered on the eye with various directions of gaze. And key here is, of course, orthokeratology, but we also have, pardon me, an increasing number of proprietary soft lens designs which will incorporate peripheral plus in the optics of the lens. And thirdly, we have the pharmacological solutions, which are well known, and atropine, of course, has an established rate of slowing down myopia progression. However, as we have all heard, there are very significant and serious side effects with use of some of these agents, and the researchers are now looking at the effectiveness of some of these things at a very, very low concentrations, such as atropine at 0.01%, appears to be somewhat effective with very minimal ocular side effects. You might see a certain bias in my own thinking with the choice of the pictures that I've put on the slide here. Certainly, I think of those various strategies, our orthokeratology patients really do enjoy the modality that we're introducing to control their myopia. So looking a bit more specifically at Paragon CRT, I'm making a very big, bold statement here. It's a personal opinion, but I would take the view that Paragon CRT lenses are easier to fit than a conventional RGP lens. Why would that be? Well, predominantly it's because we are dealing with a closed eye system. So the Paragon CRT lens is effective during sleep, and that means we can eliminate the blinking eyelid and the dynamics associated with that, with the complexities of fitting the lens. So if the eyelids aren't blinking, everything is a lot easier to deal with, and the comfort is immediately enhanced enormously. The other thing, though, is that we have with Paragon CRT a very clearly defined fitting system, and it really is what I refer to as an elegant simplicity in the way that we go about it. So we'll look at some of these features now, but it's clear to me that when we're fitting an RGP lens, there are just so many things to consider. And with Paragon CRT, all the key variables, there are only 3 of them, they're all very well defined, and there are simple steps for getting it right. What are the advantages of Paragon CRT over the competitors? Well, if we consider the other reverse geometry lenses out there, the key advantage, in my view, is that Paragon CRT has a sigmoid curve rather than a reverse geometry design. And I'll explain that a little more as we go along, but the sigmoid curve is a very unique, patented system that belongs to the Paragon CRT family lenses and to no other system. And it does produce some very, very important benefits to the CRT product. Unlike some of the competitors, the Paragon CRT lens can be controlled, each parameter can be controlled independently, which you'll see makes the system very easy to prescribe. And we do have an inventory of lenses in the practice so that when we need to change parameters, the lens that we're looking for can be taken down from the shelf and put on the patient's eye immediately. We don't have to wait for a manufacturing lead time. So manufacturing and shipping is not so much of an issue because we generally have lenses available right in the practice. The inventory comprises either 100 or 132 full prescription lenses, so they're used on a trial basis when we're establishing the fit, but often they're prescribed as the final lens that the patient wears ongoing as a full prescription lens. If we need to order another lens because of a defect or fair wear and tear over time, maybe every 12 months we often like to replace the lenses, then we know that the duplicate lenses are very highly repeatable with Paragon CRT, and their standards of manufacturing are a lot of units higher than what the industry defines as a minimum requirement. It gives me a lot of confidence when I'm ordering duplicate lenses. And all lenses, all the CRT lenses are engraved on the inside surface, the posterior lens surface, with a prescription code that looks something like this. There will be a bunch of numbers, and really the 3 key parameters are clearly defined on every lens. And believe me, in a busy RGP lens practice, there is nothing worse than an unidentified RGP lens and having to try and figure out what it is. So with these engravings, we know exactly what lens each patient is wearing on each eye. It's very important. The final thing I'm going to touch upon in terms of unique advantages to the CRT product is the concept of what they call mirrored harmonic surfaces. Pardon me. And essentially what we mean by that is that the front surface and the back surface are parallel right across the total lens diameter from edge to edge. So there are no thick junctional zones where we have to blend different curves. We have a very, very smooth sort of mathematical shape to the lens, and it's a very thin lens overall, which of course means that we get a much higher oxygen transmissibility right across the lens. So you see here up on the left, we have the central 6 millimeters of the lens being the base curve, often referred to as the treatment curve, and then between the base curve and the peripheral zone of the lens, we have the sigmoid curve, and that is where other designs will have what they would call a reverse geometry zone. So let's have a look at now how we go about fitting the Paragon CRT lens. There are essentially two steps. We are provided with this initial lens selector, which is a complex algorithm that is condensed down to a simple cardboard sliding system where we just adjust the scale to show the to identify the flat keratometer reading, and we measure on the vertical scale here the target refraction that we need for the patient, and we come up with a set of lens parameters that suggests the initial lens that we can put on the eye of the patient. When the initial lens is placed on the eye, we undergo a conventional fluorescein fitting assessment, just as we would with any normal or other RGP lens. And that gives the practitioner an enormous ability to control the lens before it's dispensed to the patient. Then the final step is the lens is dispensed for overnight wear, and we can follow up the next day and over the ensuing weeks with our topography maps, which give us further information as to just what goes on when the lens is worn overnight. So what I like about this system is, more than any other orthokeratology or corneal reshaping system, the practitioner is in control, and the practitioner is making all the key decisions along the way, rather than relying solely on the laboratory to make the decision or relying on a computer program to make the decision. So with inventory fitting, we do have, as I said, the opportunity for the practitioner to verify the fitting with the fluorescein exam. And if there is something that doesn't look right, then the correct lens can be selected out of the inventory and placed on the eye and checked and prescribed. And that means that the overnight wear, the first overnight wear, very important, is done with really a full prescription lens. It is commonly referred to as a trial lens, but in our practice, something like 90% of the time, that will continue on to be the lens that the patient continues their treatment with. One result of this procedure, having checked the lens at a fitting visit, is that the day one experience is almost always extremely positive. So we're not looking to identify error on the day one experience or the day one visit. We're really just reassuring the patient that everything is going well, and making sure that the patient managed to get the lens in the eye correctly the night before and had a good night's sleep with the lens. So it's really a very positive experience, and it's not often that we have to deal with problems on day one. And of course, when we're dealing with children, younger patients, they have a very minimal tolerance for things not working out right the first time. So if we can get it right first time, patients are happy, our parents are happy, the parents are patients, and we're off to a very good start. So what does the CRT lens look like? Well, essentially, we have three key elements to the design, and they're independently controlled. So we have the base curve, which is that central 6 millimeters, the treatment curve, and that's a spherical 6 millimeters of the lens, central 6 millimeters. Surrounding that, we have this area known as the return zone, and the variable here is known as return zone depth, and that is the key variable for controlling the overall sagittal depth, or the height of the lens as it sits above a flat surface. So this is a key parameter for controlling centration of the lens. And then the third parameter is the landing zone angle out there in the periphery of the lens, and that is designed or fitted to be a tangent to the cornea, and that's where the lens sort of bears on the peripheral cornea. So really we have two fitting variables, the return zone depth and the landing zone angle, and we have the base curve, which is not at all to do with fitting. It's an independent variable designed to control the amount of treatment that we can apply to the cornea. So that's governed by the refractive target of the eye. So here's a look at the fluorescein picture of the lens on the eye, and there's an awful amount of, a great deal of information on this slide, so let's take it step by step. When we put the lens on the eye, we like to see quite a large spherical shaped bearing zone, the treatment zone, and you can see it here identified as in profile the central 4 or 5 millimeters of the lens, and surrounding that we'll have the tear reservoir. Now the tear reservoir is a pooling of fluorescein in the mid-peripheral of the lens, and really what happens is that we get a negative suction pressure through this zone that actually causes mid-peripheral corneal thickening. And that's a key element of the treatment that we get with any orthokeratology lens. Then we have around about a 1 or 1¼ millimeter landing zone, and that's where the lens lands gently parallel to the peripheral cornea, so the tangential landing zone. And importantly, the final curve is this edge lift, and that is extremely important for venting of fluid under the lens after the lens is first applied to the eye, so that if we don't get fluid venting, then this whole sort of pattern of fluorescein under the lens just fails to develop. So that edge lift is very fundamental to the success of the overall lens. And then on the right here you see when the lens is removed after overnight wear, the epithelium tends to retain the shape of the posterior surface, and we have a new corneal shape as a result. So when we're fitting the lens, we have only 2 input data to consider. The first is the flat keratometry reading, the flat K. The second is the spherical component of the refractive error. So we're not looking at the mean value, we're looking at the spherical component, because remember we're fitting the lens along the flat or the flattest axis of the cornea. And then we put those 2 elements into our initial lens selector. As you can see, the flat K is lined up along the horizontal, and the target refraction is chosen, and we get a set of parameters from which we can put a lens on the eye and evaluate the fit. So given that we're fitting along the flat meridian, it stands to reason that our optimal results with Paragon CRT are going to be achieved with corneas that are spherical and symmetrical. So that is a key assumption, and it works well over quite a range of departure from sphericity and symmetry. But when we get to corneas that are highly asymmetrical, then we start to fall away with our effectiveness of a simple lens design, and we have to go to something a little more complex. But most of the time our corneas are going to be a close approximation to a spherical and symmetrical, and we do very well with a simple lens. Another element of discussion and debate is whether or not to use topical anaesthesia. For me, this is just, if I can use the term, it is completely a no-brainer. We always use topical anaesthesia. Why? Well, the key reason is to suppress the reflex tearing. So we don't want the tearing of the eye to wash away our fluorescein. We find that we get a much more reliable fitting pattern when we have used topical anesthetic, and we can go ahead and evaluate the fitting much more rapidly rather than waiting for the lens to settle. Another key aspect is that we're not really relying on any subjective feedback from the patient. So if the patient says that the lens is comfortable or not comfortable, or something in between, that has no bearing on the fitting of the lens. With an RGP lens for day wear, that's a little different, and we are interested in what the patient thinks with the blinking eye. But with these lenses that are designed for overnight wear, in my opinion, the subjective feedback is completely irrelevant, and we're looking at fitting the lens objectively. The final consideration, though, is that really it makes the whole process very, very simple and straightforward for our younger patients, and they remain happy and confident and motivated, and everybody has a good time when we're fitting the lenses. So we have 3 parameters to consider in the lens accurately fit, and let's take them one by one. First of all, we'll consider the base curve. Now the base curve, and this is a very important slide, and we're going to talk about this more in the next lecture about myopia control, but in my opinion and the way I work with Paragon CRT, the base curve drives the degree of myopia treatment. It is very fundamentally important for myopia control that we are careful with the base curve that we prescribe. And it is essential that the base curve is matched to the axial length of the eye. So this is a rather simplistic view where I've kind of put up a dotted line here to show how that if the axial length of the eye increases, we will need to flatten the base curve to match the treatment to the axial length of the eye. So the only time we need to flatten the base curve once we have fitted the lens initially is if the axial length of the eye should increase over time. Now it's not as simple as this diagram would suggest, but there is a fairly straightforward relationship between the base curve and an increase in the axial length. So really there is a simple defining principle here, and it was published by George Jessen a long time ago, way back in 1962, and commonly known as the Jessen Principle. And almost all orthokeratology systems, with the possible exception of the BE lens, relies on the Jessen Principle for base curve selection. And essentially what that principle says is that the base curve is the one that gives a refraction over the lens or over refraction equal to plano. So when we have the correct base curve, the over refraction will be plano and the lens will neutralize the optics of the eye. So to give you a simple example of that, if the corneal curvature measures 44 diopters or 7.67 millimeters, if we have a target refraction of 2 diopters of myopia, then the goal of the treatment here is to flatten the cornea by 2 diopters. So we need to achieve a corneal curvature of 42 diopters or 8.03 millimeters to give a refraction over lens, or a subjective refraction as it would be in this case, of plano. So it's really just a simple arithmetic approximation that works exceptionally well. So when we need to adjust the base curve with the Paragon CRT system, we have a simple method of doing that based on the refraction over the lens or the over refraction. So if the over refraction is plano, as I just described, then we know we have the correct base curve and we do not change it. That becomes a fixed entity within the system. If we, on the other hand, find a refraction over the lens or over refraction of minus 0.50, so 0.5 of negative over refraction, then that indicates that we need to flatten the base curve by 0.1 millimeters. So if we have a 7.8 base curve lens on the eye, we need to flatten that lens to 7.9 millimeters. And conversely, if we do identify a plus 0.50 over refraction, then that suggests we need to steepen the base curve by 0.1 millimeters. So really, it's as simple as that. We put the lens on the eye, we wait a few moments for the lens to settle onto the eye. Generally, whilst that's happening, I'll be having a look at the lens with the fluorescein and the slit lamp. And then when we come to do the over-refraction, we use this simple formula to identify the correct base curve. And from that point on, I know that the base curve does not need to be altered. So the fitting becomes a question of controlling and prescribing these two remaining factors, the return zone depth and the landing zone angle. So first of all, let's look at the return zone depth. As I mentioned earlier, this is the primary controller of the sagittal depth of the lens. And if you remember, the sagittal depth is the height of the lens. If it's sitting on a flat surface, the sagittal depth is the height in the axis, how high above a flat surface would the apex of the lens be. So it's the direction in this sort of y-axis. So that is a parameter that will control lens centration, and it also controls how much applanation force is applied to the lens during the treatment through the fluid forces under the lens. So if the lens is too far removed from the cornea, everything else might be perfect, but you won't get sufficient treatment because the applanating force will not be sufficient unless the lens is close enough to the cornea to do that job. So we have here what is known as proximity control technology to manipulate that clearance between the treatment curve and the apex of the cornea. So I like to think of this being the sigmoid curve as a bit like a hydraulic lift. So as we change the return zone depth, we're just lifting the roof of the treatment curve of the lens up and down in this y-axis. So some examples. Typically, the return zone is adjusted in 25 micron steps, and here we see an example of a 575 micron return zone going down through 550 and going down to 525. And as we do that, the lens becomes closer and closer to the corneal apex. So when we look at that, we find that we can control that very accurately. Now, Angela, I think we have a problem. I'm hoping we can just stop the recording briefly at this moment. Angela, are you there with me? So it's important to consider the pre-treatment maps because these will be a key indicator as to the success of the final outcome of the patient. So to simplify this and condense it into a couple of different possibilities, looking at axial maps here, we can have symmetry in terms of either a spherical or an astigmatic pattern, and we can have asymmetry here with the steep zone either below center or above center. So all of these four variations are possible, and we generally find that with the myopia control aspect of these treatments over time, we seem to do a little bit better long-term with the patients whose maps are symmetrical before we start treatment, either spherical or astigmatic. For the astigmatic maps, we do have the dual axis design that enables us to adequately fit the cornea when there is peripheral astigmatism. And this is a subject that gets a little too heavy for this introductory lecture, and Fortunately, Ken Kopp, as I said, will be dealing with this in considerable detail in his presentation in December. So I'm going to leave this alone, other than to say that really what we do with dual axis is we introduce two return zone depths, one for each of the key axes of the cornea, the flat and the steep K. But Ken will tell us later on in the year exactly how to go about that process. But it is nice that we have available now the CRT software simulator, which makes some of these trickier eyes a lot more easy to visualize before the lens is placed on the eye. And we can predict the fitting pattern using the simulator and actually manipulate some of these return zone variables and see what happens to the fluorescein pattern before the lens actually goes on the eye. So this is a great adjunct to the fitting process, and one that I use a lot with the more complex fittings. The simple spherical fittings, I generally don't find that this is necessary, and I would never ever rely on this without actually putting a lens on the eye. I just find it as to direct my thinking. So let's move on now and consider the final parameter. It's a fairly straightforward one that all lenses will have. It's a landing zone, and essentially we manipulate the landing zone to adjust the way the lens fits in the periphery, and by increasing the LZA number, we tighten the peripheral fit of the lens. So in this example, we start off with an LZA number of 32, and you can see here that we have excessive peripheral lift. So very little of the lens is actually bearing on the cornea, and we have excessive standoff or lift. And in cross-section, this prismatic cross-section shows that the lens is lifting way too much, and we need to tighten that fit to improve that peripheral fitting. So to do that, we would go to an LZA of 33. And here with the 33, we see we now have a more desirable prism in cross-section, and when we look at the fluorescein pattern, we have a much broader landing zone and a nice little, maybe 1/3 of a millimeter edge lift zone, much more desirable than this excessive one over here on the left. And then just by way of example, we show what happens if we overly tighten the lens. If we go to an LZA 34, we risk shutting down the periphery completely. And as I said, this is something we do not want to risk doing in fitting the lens. When we shut down the periphery with an excessively tight landing zone, then I find that we get very, very poor results with overnight wear, and often we don't get adequate venting of the fluid under the lens, and that can have quite a drastic effect on the optics of the treatment zone when the lens is removed the following morning. So my advice to you is when in doubt, err on the slightly loose side and try to avoid making that landing zone too tight. That often causes problems. Another little tip that I would like to mention at this stage is that because we've done all of this work in the fitting assessment of the lens, really by the time the patient wears the lens overnight, we really have a lot of confidence in the lens, and it's not all that common that we do get an unusual result with our day one topography and our day one exam. And I would suggest that it's extremely rare that I will ever change the lens parameters after a single night of wear. So if something is a little bit unusual on the day one exam, what I normally do is spend time re-instructing the patient and making sure that the patient is confident and able to easily apply the lens before going to sleep, and that the lens is positioned well on the eye. And I'll generally bring the patient back after another night or two of overnight wear before I contemplate changing the lens parameters. I mention this because it is in stark contrast to other orthokeratology systems where there is a strong emphasis often on using the day one exam to get things right. And it's all to do with smiley faces and central islands, and we just don't typically see those with the Paragon CRT system. They are possible, but they're very rare in my experience. So I'm going to move on now and just talk about 2 or 3 items that I think are fundamentally important with Aftercare. Let's remember that this is an overnight treatment, and any lens that's worn overnight will carry a risk of eye infections, so we have to be vigilant. It was in 2002, a good time ago now, that Paragon Vision Sciences received FDA clearance in the United States for overnight treatment, and that approval was for up to 6 diopters of myopia and up to 175 diopters of astigmatism without any age restrictions at that time. So that's basically the what we feel that the lens has authority to tackle as a treatment range, although we generally feel more comfortable with treatments in the range of maybe up to 4 or 5 diopters, and astigmatism usually in the order of about a diopter or so. And then beyond that, we more commonly look at the more complex dual axis design of the lens. So with the Aftercare visits, we have a checklist of important things that need to be done. Of course, we always start with a history. I like to measure the uncorrected visual acuity in each eye. We do slit lamp exam, and I consider that as my safety check, the all-important safety check, making sure there are no unwanted changes to the ocular surface. I use corneal topography to monitor treatment efficacy, and that is my #1 tool for evaluating the progression of the treatment over time. And I think probably it's fair to say that what distinguishes those practitioners who have more experience with CRT and other forms perhaps of corneal reshaping is that as we go along we get more and more adept and proficient at using topography to interpret just how well things are going along for us. Important is to inspect the lens surface, particularly after the first 3 to 6 months, and make sure that the lens surface is in pristine as new condition. And if the uncorrected visual acuity score is reduced unexpectedly for one reason or another, I will put the lens on the eye and do a refraction over the lens or an over-refraction as a check for possible myopia progression. And then all important, at every visit we do need to be vigilant and monitor patient compliance, and there are just so many little things that we want our patients to get right on an ongoing basis. So let's just have a quick look at that first. I love this picture of the 3 brothers here, all hard at work cleaning their lenses in the bathroom, and I think that is just an ideal scenario of these children all behaving magnificently. You know, I find that our kids are great with these lenses. You know, one thing about children, you teach them what to do, and they do it. They're probably better than our adults at sticking to the rules and not taking shortcuts over time. Once they get it, they tend to stay with it. So we put a lot of time and effort into training or coaching our children at the very beginning. I no longer do that myself. I have the luxury of a highly skilled orthoptist who does that for me, and I know for a fact that my assistant does the patient training much more thoroughly than I ever did when I was doing it myself. They just put a lot more time and effort, and by the time each child leaves our practice, they've probably applied and removed a lens into each eye 2 or 3 times over, and they really know what they're doing, and they're very confident. So all of our children, even the younger ones at 6 or 7 years of age, we encourage them to be entirely responsible for their own lens care, their own lens application, removal and cleaning. We do rely on the parents for supervision and support. And occasionally the parents will help with cleaning the lenses, but I do really think that the children do it very well all by themselves most often. And essential is the follow-up visit schedule. You know, if we're going to keep these programs working well, then we probably need to see our children going smoothly, particularly over the first 2 years. And we have in our practice an Excel spreadsheet that we use with a time function so that we, at the push of a button, can readily track how long it is since our patients last came along for their aftercare visits. So if anyone has failed to attend for aftercare, we can identify those patients very rapidly and get on the phone and chase them, make sure they come back in. Really important. Now, I love this slide. It's a little bit extreme, but I do like to introduce it at this stage just to remind everybody that hygiene is not just simply about washing hands. Of course, hand hygiene is critically important, but we do have to remember the importance of the whole ocular adnexa, washing the face, the eyelids, the lashes, keeping the whole thing clean. Otherwise, there is risk, of course, in applying a lens that the lens might just happen to trap a small particle that might have been, you know, just on the eyelashes at the time and fell into the eye. So the cleaner the whole system, the better. So we do talk about facial hygiene as well as hand hygiene. Now, this is a little late in the piece to be talking about the gold standard of treatment, but it introduces some important thinking here, so I will just go through this with you. My personal definition of what we seek to achieve with our patient treatments is really good centration is fundamentally important. I do allow a little bit of latitude with centration, but we're very strict that the lens is centered within maybe a 1/4 to 1/2 millimeter of perfection with centration. So we have some slides further on to show how important that is. When we're dealing with a refractive target, we do need to hit that target very accurately, and it's wonderful that with Paragon CRT, we seem to be able to achieve that just about every time. We have no trouble hitting the target very precisely with our CRT treatments. That means, of course, that the patients typically get clear, consistent, uncorrected visual acuity. So part of that is up to the patient. So we typically find that it takes patients 2 to 4 weeks to develop their own routines whereby they can be consistent with their lens care, their lens cleaning, their lens application, and so on, so that when they remove the lens every day, they do get consistent results from day to day. Importantly, we want the whole thing to be non-invasive, and by non-invasive, I mean non-invasive at the level of no staining, no observable change to the ocular surface, and even to the level of 1 hour after lens removal, we want to see a stable precorneal tear film. So we don't even expect to see any disruption to our tear film. Hopefully we get a good breakup time in excess of 8 to 10 seconds, and the eyes behave pretty much as if there has been no treatment lens on overnight at all. So that's usually what we start patients off with. And what I've learned over the years is that there is certainly no guarantee that that condition will persist over time. And we have to work very hard with follow-up visits to maintain that gold standard. And when patients fall by the wayside, in a sense, and fail to come back for their aftercare visits, then in time, invariably, things are likely to start to change. And here I present an example. Again, it's somewhat extreme, but you know, this patient here, with the lens removed from the eye several hours ago, came in for a checkup because they were a little bit concerned. They felt that the eye just wasn't quite right, a little bit blurry, nothing too extreme, a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit dry, but just wanted me to have a bit of a look and see if I could identify a problem. Well, you know, really this, I think you'll agree, is really a more serious accident waiting to happen, and this is a very compromised looking eye, and over time, if we don't get onto this and remediate, then this eye is at risk of a secondary infection. So here's what the map looked like, and what was really alarming with this condition was that I know that the patient was fitted initially with a very well-fitting lens, but over time the lens just changed. It changed in ways that I'll describe in a moment or two. And it started to appear to be a very ill-fitting and really a bad situation. So the warning here is that this happens slowly over time, and sometimes it can be accompanied with very minimal symptomatology. So we do need to see these patients back regularly to avoid some of these unwanted scenarios. So in this situation, what happened was the lens looked pretty normal until we took it off the eye or out of the lens case and blotted it dry and inspected it closely with under magnification. So here I'm mounting the lens on a slit lamp and having a look at the lens in the dry state with illumination from behind, a sort of retro illumination. And when we do this, we can see sometimes a build-up of what I call a film deposit. There's a lot of protein and other material in these deposits, and they can have different distributions from fairly geographic to central to very specific to this sigmoid curve area of the lens. And any one of these distributions is capable of producing an outcome where the visual acuity is dramatically reduced, and the lens in this situation here can look like the one that I showed you in the previous slide. So it's very important with every aftercare check to, over time, to ensure that the patients bring their lenses along. I like to identify the engravings to make sure they're wearing the lenses in the right eyes, in the correct eyes, and that they're not wearing an older lens that they might have had from years ago. We want to make sure that the patients are wearing the lens that they're supposed to be wearing, and that the lens is nice and clean and doesn't have any of this film deposit. Now, the film deposit can be removed with an intensive cleaner such as Progent, and sometimes we don't even do that. We just replace with a brand new lens, so that's a matter of practitioner choice. We don't use Progent 100% of the time with our patients because this situation really typically does not occur, we find, when patients do a daily digital rubbing with a surfactant cleaning. So daily surfactant cleaner really avoids this situation in most cases, and I would say these protein films build up in around about maybe 15 to 20% of cases. Really, in my view, it doesn't justify using Progent in 100% of cases, but once again, that's a matter for practitioner discrimination. We like to use Progent in the office rather than issuing it to our younger patients because it's highly toxic and really needs to be done under supervision. So here's a second aspect of aftercare that I think is critically important, and it's refraction. And really, I don't do a full subjective refraction at every follow-up visit. I just think it's unnecessary. What I like to look at are my topography maps, and I just believe I get a lot more information from the maps in terms of identifying the axial treatment map and the distribution of the treatment across the treatment zone. So I look at these four aspects: the centration, the diameter, the shape, and the regularity. And these things need to be going nicely if the treatment is proceeding well. And importantly, the optics do vary significantly across the treatment zone in some cases. So in this example here, we might find that in one quadrant we're getting a very high level uncorrected visual acuity of about 6/5, and most of the treatment zone might be falling behind that. So a simple refraction won't give us all that information, which is why I like to look at these treatment zone optics in preference or in conjunction with an overfraction sometimes. So here's another example of a decentered treatment zone, and certainly we don't like to see this. This is a case where we need to refit the lens and maybe increase the return zone depth to attempt to get this lens to center more accurately. But if we rely just on the uncorrected visual acuity score and maybe a subjective refraction, we might be misled into thinking that things are going better than they really are. So in this situation here, the left eye got a very high level uncorrected visual acuity, even in the face of a highly decentered map. And sometimes with decentered maps, you do get these small little windows of very high visual acuity. So it really is important to look at your topography maps in preference to just visual acuity scores alone. Now here is perhaps my most complex slide for this session, and hopefully we can walk you through it. And if you can understand this slide, I think it will take you a long way to really managing your patients extremely well over time. So patient comes in and we diagnose an undertreatment, and the question is, do we need to change the base curve of the lens or not? So I'm going to give you two examples here. The first example is with the patient wearing a relatively new lens. So the lens has been dispensed within the last 4 to 8 weeks or so, and the patient comes in and we measure in the aftercare visit an uncorrected visual acuity of 6/12, and perhaps we do a subjective refraction and find that there's a 1 diopter refraction and the patient achieves 6/6. What do we do? Well, the next thing that I would do is I would put the lens on the eye and I would perform an over refraction or a refraction over lens with the lens in situ on the eye. Now, if that over refraction produces a plano outcome, then that tells me that I do not need to change the base curve. And we have some fitting issues to address. So this is incredibly important with respect to myopia control, because we do not want to flatten the base curve unnecessarily if we're going to have as much ability to contain the myopia as possible, and more on that in the next lecture. So we really just want to leave the base curve alone if possible, and for example, if the return zone depth is a little greater than it should be, this result is entirely possible. Now I'm going to look at the second situation, and here we give the example of an older lens, and meaning a lens that might be 3, 6, 9, 12 months or older. We put the older lens in the eye and we get a patient comes in with wearing overnight an older lens, but they come in for their aftercare check, and we find that the uncorrected visual acuity is 6/12 and the refraction is a -1. With an older lens, what I typically do is I put a new lens, a new duplicate lens on the eye and perform the refraction over lens again, and use that measurement to see whether or not the base curve needs to be changed. So if a duplicate lens on the eye gives me a Plano over refraction, a brand new lens, then that tells me once again that I do not need to change the base curve. So as you can see here, I am very, very cautious about changing base curve, and often with these older lenses, all you need to do is put a brand new duplicate lens back into the system, and all of the patient problems are immediately remediated, and everything is okay, and we check the patient a month later, and everything's back to 6/6 uncorrected once again, and we don't have to change the parameters at all. So I hope that's understandable. It's a fairly complex slide. What it's saying is try to deal with issues by addressing the fit first, and only change the base curve if there is a need to do so, as indicated by the refraction over the lens. Okay, so a little bit on safety. Occasionally we get patients who will say, well, you know, the lens hurts my eye, and I've been putting up with this for a little while, and here is again an extreme example of where there was a foreign body particle under the lens that might have been trapped overnight and resulted in a small corneal abrasion that took some time to heal. And if the patient continues wearing the lens, then the healing of such a lesion can be very, very slow indeed. And patients might just persist despite the feeling that the lens is not right, and there's some discomfort and pain. And I think here you'll observe that there is an absolute minimum, I'm sorry, I'll go back, of inflammatory response around the limbus. So this is an eye that has you know, a clean lesion. There's no secondary infection, but certainly it's at risk. And we do have to remind our patients that the lenses should only be worn if they're comfortable. And if there's a problem with comfort, then the lenses should not be worn. We have a consent form that clearly identifies this with the golden rule that if in doubt, take them out or don't wear the lenses. And I think from time to time, it's a very good idea to remind the parents of our patients, our younger patients, and the patients themselves that you know, it's very important not to wear the lenses if they're at all uncomfortable. And maybe they should be reminded to reread some of these messages when they come in for aftercare. So I think when I'm dealing with these sorts of issues, it just reminds me that you know, first and foremost in any of these systems, any of these treatments is the patient's safety. And it's a little bit like the airlines. So I like to say to our patients that your safety is our #1 concern. It's just like what you hear over the intercom when you buckle up and get comfortable for a long-haul flight. It's all about safety. And every time I look at the eyes with the slit lamp, I tell patients we're really concerned about your safety. We want to make sure that that everything's good. And my tip for you guys, all of us when we're working with these systems, is that in order to keep these systems going well, we need to pay attention to detail and really remember to monitor compliance. So that's basically it for the presentation. We've covered these 3 aspects in the agenda. And I just want to wrap up by saying that Paragon CRT really has been a tremendous system for me. It gives me enormous satisfaction and joy working with these patients. I find it very easy and simple and straightforward to fit. We find that we enjoy working with a lens system that enables us to vary each of the parameters independently. And really, when we're working with Paragon CRT, everything is simple and has an elegant simplicity about it. So I would encourage you to get involved if you're not already involved. And if you're fitting Paragon CRT already, I hope that some of these little tips have been useful to you, and hope to give you success with your patients in the future. So Angela, I'm going to wrap it up there and say thank you to everybody for your attention with this presentation, and I'll hand it over for a Q&A session. If we have any questions, I'd be happy to address any questions at this time. Thank you.